We begin today's class in the city of Istanbul, at what was once the Christos Church, built about 1,000 years ago. In one of the side chapels here of this church, then a mosque, now partially a museum, we have a beautiful dome that shows Christ at the center surrounded by the prophets. Some of these we'll recognize already: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. But then, who are the others? These are the minor prophets, and they're the subject of our class today. Who are the minor prophets? When we hear their names, to us they might sound like the names of old sea captains. They are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The minor prophets are called minor, not because they're any less important or less inspired than the major prophets, but because their letters are much shorter. When you think about the works that we've already covered, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, we'll remember that they encompass a series of revelations from God received over a wide series of years in different events, and that they deal with more overarching themes in a more developed manner. And we can think, though, too, if the major prophets do a wonderful job at showing how God is present to his people in the nitty-gritty of history, the minor prophets do so, in a sense, even better. Their letters are much shorter, but much more directed in how God speaks to a particular situation. And so sometimes we can find they can have even more emotion, more feeling, as the prophet makes known the message of God that they have received. First, though, I think it'll be helpful to review the history of this era, just very briefly to give us the sense of the background against which the work of the prophets was carried out. Around the year 1000 BC, we have the reign of King David, who with his son King Solomon presided over Israel and the people of Israel during the golden age of their history. After Solomon, however, the Jewish people split between two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And both kingdoms are threatened for the centuries that follow by the larger, more powerful empires that surround them. It's against this background the prophets speak their message, exhorting their people to turn away from sin and to live with greater faithfulness to God. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrian Empire, based in what is now northern Iraq. After this, the Jewish people that live in that area are then dispersed and basically lose their cohesion as an ethnic group. In 587 BC, the kingdom of Judah falls to the Babylonian Empire, centered in what is now central Iraq. The inhabitants of Judah are able to keep together because they're brought as a body into exile in Babylon. In the 530s BC, the Persian Empire, and a lot of names, right? But the Persian Emperor Cyrus conquers the Babylonians and allows the Jews to return home, however now being a part of his empire. Towards the end of the prophetic period, the power of the Greeks begins to be felt. In the 330s, Alexander the Great begins his series of conquests, including the Persian Empire. So now the Greeks are the new landlord. So we see then how this whole era, 4 centuries, is marked by turmoil and war and division, but also that throughout it all, God was faithful to his people and calls the prophets to make his presence and his word known to them. Now that we have a sense over the broad outlines of what happened during this time, let's look at the minor prophets themselves. I think it'll be easiest if we approach them first by looking at the major themes they cover, and then looking at them themselves. As I go through these themes, you'll recognize that a lot of them are the same kinds of things we've heard in the major prophets that we've already covered. And so I'll just cover them in a sense of a very general angle, because each of the minor prophets covers them in a more particular way that we can only really appreciate if we approach them individually. To be very general, before the conquest and the exile of their kingdoms, the message the prophets delivered was one of the need to turn back to God, and of God's supreme justice, which would ultimately be vindicated. It was also involved condemnations of unfaithfulness and immorality. After the conquest or exile, the message now shifts to one of consolation, of condemnation of the foreign nations that conquered God's people, and of a promise of restoration and renewal of the covenant, even in a way that begins to show the first glimmerings of an expectation of a Messiah, an anointed one, who will fulfill all of God's promises. For example, in one of these later prophets, Malachi, we find in chapter 3, verse 1, "Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." So although these words were inspired to be written down centuries before the birth of Christ, can't we see how it's beginning to awaken the expectation that the Lord will come somehow in a way still unknown? So these prophets then prepare for the coming of the Messiah by building up this hope that not only will God restore things, but that he won't be restoring them just to the way they were before, but rather in a new, even more fulfilled way. Now that we've covered the major themes, let's take a very brief individual look at the prophets. We'll be going through them according to the period in which they lived, and I'll also mention where they carried out their prophetic work, and also what some of their major ideas were. In the time before the exile, we first encounter the prophet Amos, who was a native of Judah sent to the northern kingdom of Israel. He was actually a herdsman and a sycamore grower, so not even someone with any formal religious training, who nevertheless is called by God to be a prophet. In Amos chapter 7, verses 14 to 15, we hear how he responds when he's challenged by one of the priests at the temple of God in the kingdom of Israel, who says, "Who are you to come and speak God's word?" Amos responds, "I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" In his messages, Amos would speak of the people's unfaithfulness to God, despite the outward continuation of worship, which is why he's confronted at a temple. But what he's saying is that the worship is empty unless their lives outside of worship reflect the same reality. This same theme is also present in Hosea, who's also writing in Israel. He's called by God to marry a prostitute as a way of personally experiencing what it's like for God when he sees his people's unfaithfulness. So here we see sexual infidelity being compared to the idolatry that God's people so often fell into. Both of them show how intimate these infidelities are. Next we have Micah, who wrote in Judah around the same time as first Isaiah and covers many of the same themes. His message was a blend of threatened punishment for sins, along with the promise of a restoration that will be brought about by God's power. We next encounter Zephaniah, who also wrote in Judah, who also wrote of God's judgment of his people for their unfaithfulness, that again will be brought about by a renewal accomplished not because of the people's works, but because of God's power. We next encounter Nahum, who takes a little bit of a different angle. His messages are mainly directed towards Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. These were likely written in the context of the unsuccessful Assyrian invasion of the southern kingdom of Judah after their successful conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in the late 8th century BC. He delivered a series of messages of condemnation against Nineveh with corresponding ones of encouragement for Judah. We now come to the prophet Habakkuk, who, from what he writes, seems to be writing around the same time or in the same context as the prophet Jeremiah. So now we're getting a little closer to the time of the kingdom of Judah's fall to the Babylonians. Like Jeremiah, he issues a very stern call to repentance. But as we'll see a little bit later, these are received in what's an intimate personal conversation between God and the prophet. This time brings us up to the time of the exile. We have the prophet Obadiah, who's roughly contemporaneous with Ezekiel, writing in the aftermath of Judah's conquest with words of condemnation against the Edomites, who were ethnically related to the Jewish people, but yet assisted the Babylonians in conquering the Jewish people. In the time after the exile, we have the prophet Haggai, who, like Ezekiel, is very precise at when his messages are received. God calls him to be a prophet and begins to give him his messages on the 29th of August, 520, and he receives his last message on the 18th of December of the same year. So these are the years after the return from exile, probably about a decade and a half or so, when the work of rebuilding the temple has begun. And Haggai exhorts the people to keep their faith central to their lives, but especially seeing the temple as a physical manifestation of that. As they're rebuilding the city, he encourages to keep the rebuilding of the temple as central to their efforts. The prophet Zechariah received God's messages around the same time, beginning in late October 520 BC and continuing until the 7th of December 518 BC. Now, somewhat like Isaiah, there are two periods of composition for Zechariah. First Zechariah, chapters 1 to 8, were received in the time frame that I just gave you, in the time after exile, when God's people are coming back home, but under Persian control. Second Zechariah, chapters 9 to 14, seems to have developed from the school of Zechariah, Zechariah's followers in the prophetic work, but were recorded during the time of Greek domination that followed Alexander the Great's conquest of the area. First Zechariah, just like Haggai, sees the project of rebuilding the temple as central to the restoration of the land, since it is a way of showing the centrality of the people's relationship to God. And so, kind of little comment here, we see on the one hand in the prophetic works the condemnation of an empty false worship, but at the same time this is balanced out by a recognition that true worship is important. In fact, it's the most important thing we do. So what the prophets do is condemn a religious formalism that's empty, but at the same time call people to have a worship that is true and life-giving. Second Zechariah is a series of undated prophecies, a series of messages of encouragement for the people to remain faithful to God and their identity, even in the face of cultural dominations by their new Greek overlords. The prophet Malachi, which I should say isn't even his proper name. Rather, Malachi simply means my messenger in Hebrew. Encourage the people to authentic worship, like I just said. A worship not just of empty words, but one that has an interior dimension as well. The prophet Joel expresses a cry for help to the Lord in the face of attack, and the relief that the Lord gives them. The prophet Jonah is a little bit of a unique case. We're all familiar with the story of Jonah being thrown overboard and taken in the belly of a whale for 3 days. Although the book of Jonah is included with the other minor prophets, it's really a very different style than we find in the other ones. The book of Jonah isn't a series of messages received from God. In fact, Jonah's only message is fairly brief. 40 days more and Nineveh will be destroyed. But it's rather a narrative, a story that conveys a teaching. We encounter a prophet by the name of Jonah, son of Amittai, in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25, but without much further detail being given. In the book of Jonah, Jonah is called to be a prophet, but runs in the other direction. After his experience in the belly of the fish, he goes on his mission, and admittedly with little hope of success, since he was a Jew going to the capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the greatest enemies of his people. When his message is received, Jonah doesn't rejoice in its success, but instead pouts over the fact that his enemies have been spared, albeit because of his message. But then God confronts him at the very end of the book. In a sense, this is the very last line, the punch that the book delivers. God confronts Jonah with the reality that for all the Assyrians have done, he says, should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? So what we could say of the book of Jonah is that it's could perhaps best be characterized as a parable, or even as a narrative critique of a narrow-minded or nationalistic mindset. A sense that God is just our God. Instead, Jonah says no, that God cares for all people, although certainly the message of the prophets is that the Jewish people, as God's people, have a special claim to his care. In the book of Jonah, then, we see reflected a sense of God's universal will of salvation for all peoples that can be found in the other prophets, although not as centrally. It's a reminder from one Jew to another Jew that God is not just theirs, but rather that he also cares for all people. Now that we've briefly looked over all of the different prophets, I'd like to just take one passage from one of them and dig into it a little more deeply. Now again, I hope that you'll take time to read the minor prophets on their own. The books are all short, some of them are only one chapter long, and you'll see how each of them has a little different angle of how God has revealed his message to them to be shared with his people. So we look at Habakkuk, chapter 2, verses 1 to 14. But first to look at the context. The book of Habakkuk has a very simple structure, only 3 chapters, each in the form of a poem. In the first of them, the prophet laments to God over the sinfulness he sees in the coming judgment. He says, the prophet almost accuses God, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and thou wilt not hear?" Habakkuk isn't speaking of the sinfulness of his own people, but also fearing the coming devastation at the hand of the Babylonians, a devastation that he knows is going to be an expression of God's justice being executed. So what he's saying then is, God, we know what's coming. What are you going to do about all of this? In chapter 2, God responds to the prophet, delivering his judgment. In chapter 3, the prophet expresses his trust in God's will and his awe at God's power, through which true justice will prevail. Now, into our passage. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 to 14. I will take my stand to watch, and station myself on the tower, and look forth to see what he will say to me, and what he will answer concerning my complaint. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain upon the tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its time, it hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, he whose soul is not upright in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is treacherous. The arrogant man shall not abide. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations, and collects as his own all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, in scoffing derision of him, and say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, for how long, and loads himself with pledges? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be booty for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you, for the blood of men and violence to the earth, to cities, and to all who dwell therein. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe of the reach of harm. You have devised shame to your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood, and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor only for fire, and nations weary themselves for naught? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. A little bit of commentary over this passage. So, as I said at the beginning, this passage, chapter 2, is the part of the dialogue where the prophet's receiving God's message. Notice how he does it. He goes up to a high point to be closer to God. He shows a readiness to accept God's message, as opposed to, well, for example, Jonah, who hides from God's message. God responds, beginning with the instruction to write the message in big letters. In other words, make this public, because I want my word to be known. First, he reminds the prophet to be patient, to trust in God, that even if it doesn't seem like he's responding to the situation, he is, in his own way and in his own time. God then goes on to present to the prophet a series of parallels in which the conduct of the just is contrasted to that of the wicked. And notice how this is presented both in a personalized sense and in a national one as well. The arrogant man of the prophecy is simply a personalization of the Babylonians, whose greed is expressed through their continual conquests. Notice the imagery, though. The very material of the cities they build, the stones and the beams, cry out at the wrongs being done. In the end, what do all of these conquests come to? Is it not from the Lord that they labor only for fire? In other words, for all of their work, all of the energy they put into their conquests, isn't it the Lord's doing that in the end, it all comes to nothing? The closing line of this passage is very, very close to Isaiah 11:9. The chapter begins with the famous image, this is in Isaiah, a root shall sprout from the stump of Jesse. But that same passage ends with, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Of course, God inspired both scriptures, but also shows how, on the human side of things, because the human authors of these books of the Bible are true authors themselves, that there were certain images they carried from generation to generation. In the end, then, we see from this passage that it is God's judgment, and not the power of earthly nations, that will have the last word. We'll conclude with a few points of theological reflection. This passage that we just heard speaks to anyone who has ever felt frustrated by God's seeming silence or inaction in the face of injustice, whether on a personal or a societal level. The prophet Habakkuk gives us a great example of real prayer. Notice how it's candid, honest, a true bearing of the soul before God, without any pretense, even to the point of almost accusing God of inaction in the face of evil. However, notice how Habakkuk also shows us that we need to be ready to receive God's response to our prayer, by how he goes up to a high place to be able to seemingly receive God's message more readily. Another message from this passage is a foreshadowing of what Christ will later teach, that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. The message then has two dimensions. There's one of both personal reassurance that living a just life will be rewarded in the end, while also teaching that an overbearing, conqueror, unjust person will in the end fall the same way that they rose. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I know we were only able to take a very passing glance at most of the minor prophets, but I hope that some of the ideas and themes that I've given you to look for today will help to inspire you to explore them on your own. As I said, they're very brief. Many of them could be read at one sitting, but in each of them we encounter a different way that God is speaking to his people at different times, but all with the same message of conversion and consolation. And now, a few questions for reflection on your own part. Question 1. How honest is my prayer? Am I truly open with God about my frustrations and difficulties, including with his plan? Question 2. When have I felt frustrated with how God's plan was working out in my own life? And how did it resolve itself? Question 3. What is an example of how I've seen God's justice work itself out in history, rewarding the just and punishing the wicked?